mentioned that there were 7 astronauts aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia when it lost contact with NASA at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, roughly 2.5 hours ago. We know that their families were taken almost immediately to an undisclosed location there at Cape Canaveral, the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. You're looking at the pictures right now of Rick Husband, the commander of the Space Shuttle, and the other members of the Space Shuttle. There's William McCool, who was the pilot, 41-year-old pilot, David Brown, one of the mission specialists, and the other members, Michael Anderson, another mission specialist, age 43, Kalpana Chawla, also a mission specialist, and also Laurel Clark. And in addition to that, the first Israeli astronaut ever, Ilan Ramon, a payload specialist, a colonel in the Israeli Air Force. As we think about their fates, and also, as you mentioned, the fate of those 3 astronauts who are currently aboard the Space Shuttle, and you mentioned a point that is certainly worth mentioning, which is that there's no doubt that the shuttle fleet will now be grounded. How quickly can an investigation like this proceed, and how quickly do they need to get back to those astronauts in space?
Well, I'm sure we have all the talent of NASA, if not in Florida right now. They'll be en route there and gathering around to assemble all the possible data that they can to make the timely decisions as to what to do. The astronaut and cosmonauts up at the space station do have a Soyuz spacecraft that is a crew emergency return vehicle that they can come back at any time. But I think as many past events in space would testify, it's best not to rush into drastic decisions. There's nothing wrong with the space station right now. There's no need for any drastic action. There may be supply capabilities available through the Progress resupply ships, but I feel certain that the crew in the space station will have to come down before another fully assembled crew would go back up again, because that would probably be on the next shuttle flight. We have replaced the crew return vehicle last November, and the next cycle for it to be replaced will be in April. So they may send up a fresh Soyuz spacecraft before having the crew that's on board the space station right now, committing them to return in the Soyuz that's up there. Well, so much for the space station. There are many people who will be looking at that situation. And of course, the entire nation is going to be looking very closely at the southeastern United States and the areas where there may be portions of the Space Shuttle Columbia. And I think everyone has been warned to stay very clear of those locations so that they can avoid any hazardous material, but also so that the investigation can continue in a very straightforward way.
Former astronaut Buzz Aldrin, American hero, speaking to us on this most heart-wrenching of days. Just to repeat, it was 2 hours and 32 minutes ago that NASA lost contact with the Space Shuttle Columbia. NBC's Jim Miklashevsky at the White House has reported that a U.S. military satellite noted a heat spike at roughly that same moment that we now believe was the catastrophic explosion or malfunction aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia. Certainly no indication that any of the 7 astronauts on board somehow survived that horrendous event. It was almost instantaneously that camera crews in Texas, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, in the Palestine area, in Waco, Texas, started to record the video that you're seeing here, the debris of the Space Shuttle Columbia hurtling to Earth. It had been traveling at 12,500 miles an hour at roughly 39 miles up in the sky. So a wide debris field, very dangerous for anyone in that vicinity of Texas or Louisiana. Right now, we're going to turn it over to NBC's Brian Williams to continue our coverage. For Soledad O'Brien, I'm David Bloom in New York. Good day.
And David, thank you, as America now has another tragic piece of videotape that will no doubt be repeated throughout this day and in the days to come, the apparent disintegration of the space shuttle right about at the center portion of the state of Texas. We are going to go to NBC News White House correspondent David Gregory, who has just emerged from the West Wing with more information. David?
Brian, I've been speaking to White House officials who say that at the moment, with the senior staff assembled here at the White House, they are fully investigating any scenario that might involve terrorism, anything beyond a mechanical catastrophe. But officials telling NBC News at this point, there is no reason to believe that terrorism or any foul play was involved with this unfolding disaster. The president is now approximately a half an hour away from the White House. He was at the presidential retreat of Camp David. He will, we're told, speak to the nation at some point today. He, within the past hour, has been in touch with the head of NASA, Sean O'Keefe. His chief of staff, Andy Card, has also spoken with Mr. O'Keefe. They are monitoring the situation. They're getting all the latest information as NASA sorts through all of their available information and prepares to brief the country themselves. The president will not speak until NASA briefs the country with all the information that it has. There has certainly been a lot of discussion about the fact that among the astronauts, the first ever from Israel, we're told by officials that government officials, administration officials, have been in touch with their counterparts in the Israeli government. The president has not yet called Prime Minister Sharon. That is a judgment that has been made. That call has not been made yet. We also know that Secretary of Homeland Security, Tom Ridge, has also been very active talking to local officials in Texas and Louisiana. There is a huge public safety component to be coordinated as NASA tries to figure out what happened on the ground with falling debris that is very dangerous. People should stay away from it, NASA says. It's important that the White House coordinate through Homeland Security with local officials to make sure that people stay away from that area and that effort is mobilized. So again, the president is on his way back. He learned about this earlier this morning from his chief of staff, Andy Card. He does intend to speak to the nation at some point today after NASA gets more information. But again, Brian, it bears repeating that while an investigation of every scenario goes on with the senior staff assembled here at the White House, the president's chief political advisor, Karl Rove, his press staff, the national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice, and his chief of staff. While that investigation on every front continues, administration officials saying there is no reason to believe at this point that terrorism or any other act of foul play is involved. The president has been in touch directly with the head of NASA as he continues to monitor these events. Brian.
David, as you point out, the huge difference between what apparently is a national tragedy and what could have been a national emergency of some kind, it also bears repeating the FBI not at all involved in this. Intelligence officials say they noticed nothing untoward prior to launch, at the time of launch, or all morning this morning. Prior to this, perhaps you can go back over the president's schedule these past 12 hours. They were supposed to go to Camp David, the President and Prime Minister Blair, yesterday, but that was put off, correct?
It was, because of the weather we have down here, rain and fog. It's not ideal conditions to travel by helicopter to Camp David, which, as you know, is about an hour away in the Maryland mountains. So the president getting word of this morning. He was spending the weekend at Camp David and has come back via limousine, via his motorcade. And as I say, he's about a half an hour out or so after first talking with his chief of staff, Andy Card. So certainly monitoring the media coverage of this and talking directly to NASA. Again, it bears repeating, the administration stressing that while so much information is out there, there's so much that is not known at this point. The president fully intends to address the American people, but not until more information can be shared, more conclusions can be drawn about what is an unfolding catastrophe. Brian.
David Gregory from the White House lawn this morning. And again, this president will be forced to calm an entire nation. We do expect the president to speak at some point today, again, pending confirmation of a lot of the information that is out there. We expect the president to take to the airwaves and address the nation at some point when the White House feels it would be necessary and appropriate. We have no official confirmation of death of the 7 astronauts on board the Shuttle Columbia, which, if you're just joining us, was making its 28th flight in a 22-year-long program, 113 flights in all, and apparently broke up at around 200,000 feet at around Mach 6, would put it roughly at 12,000 miles an hour over central Texas. And as David Bloom pointed out, camera crews for miles around rushed to get the best vantage point. And as people join our coverage throughout the day, perhaps hearing the worst, there is at least one New York radio station with a live reporter in Midtown Manhattan interviewing people about the possibility of terrorism. That is, by all accounts and according to all the evidence, absolutely not the case here. This appears to be a catastrophic system failure on the shuttle itself, and not the work of any foreign hands that would do any harm to the space shuttle astronauts. Jay Barbary, our veteran correspondent who has covered every manned space mission this nation has launched, is with us from the Cape by telephone. Jay, what can you add to the reporting so far?
Well, Brian, you pretty well covered it. We're waiting right now for a news conference to be held here at the Kennedy Space Center. It could be coming up any time. They first estimated 11:30. Now they're trying to get everybody together, and it could happen in the next 5 minutes or the hour, or within an hour, I should say. All that they know at this time is that everything was on course. Everything was going perfectly. The Shuttle Columbia was speeding at 12,500 miles per hour, 39 miles above central Texas when this catastrophe took place. So there's little doubt left that the Columbia has been lost, that the crew has been lost, and that we have tracking video of it coming down over East Texas and possibly into Louisiana. And as you said earlier, Brian, it is essential that if anybody finds any of this debris to stay away from it because of the rocket fuel on board. It's called hypergolic fuel, which simply means it's oxidizer, and the fuel on contact ignites. But more importantly, if you breathe it, it will set up oxygen membrane over the oxygen sacs in your lungs, and you could suffocate from it within 48 hours. So please stay away from it. Keep everybody away from it. And now they're going back over all their tracking information, trying to pin down what happened, to get some handle on what could have happened here at the place on the reentry, Brian, where it was leaving space and the Columbia was becoming an airplane. Space begins at 60 miles up. It was at approximately 40 miles. It had gotten enough into the atmosphere that they were beginning to use the flight control systems for the atmosphere on board the shuttle. They had turned off their attitude control thruster rockets, and it was at this point with the auxiliary power units running full speed and everything happening as they became an airplane, and apparently something went wrong.
Now, Jay, you mentioned aircraft as opposed to spacecraft. It would probably be a good time to talk about the notion of the black box that so many Americans have become familiar with commercial and other aircraft. Is it not true that in the space business there is a constant real-time live streaming black box in effect on the ground? That is to say, all those people we are familiar seeing at all those control panels are looking at all the incoming data, and is it not further possible to say that they could know, there could be someone now who has a fairly good idea which system failed primarily?
That is true, Brian. You're looking at the black box when you look at mission control. When you see all of those guys sitting in there, all of that information on all the systems within the shuttle is being transmitted down by data through the TDRS satellite back down to mission control. They are looking at it. The only indication we got was before they lost communications with the crew, they lost some sensors. I have been trying to find out what sensors, but no one seems to know from the Public Affairs Office or the people that I can talk to. Other sources are, of course, within looking at the data now. So perhaps in this news conference coming up, we can get a little bit more information on this. But there are systems, of course, recorders on board, but the likelihood that spacecraft or now an aircraft traveling at 12,500 miles per hour coming through the atmosphere, it's very hard to believe that anything would be left. But they are going over their tracking data, and we also mentioned about the spy satellites up there. We would have some information on some of the systems that would be picking up what went on. If there was an explosion, if they would have a heat spike that they would be picking up, and then they would know from that at what time it occurred. But most of the information, Brian, is there, just like it was there on Challenger. They suspected different things at different times on Challenger. First, the suspect was it was an engine that gave loose, but it turned out to be one of the O-rings on, I believe, the right-hand booster. Yes, it was a right-hand booster. But because when the shuttle took off, Challenger took off, it rotated 180 degrees and put the solid rocket booster north of all the cameras. It wasn't until NASA went and got its cameras from the north side of the beach that they saw this plume of smoke take place. They saw the eruption of the flame coming between the field joint splice of the right solid booster rocket, and then they knew 2 days afterwards what had happened. It took
the warning went up from NASA immediately that should you come upon what looks to be a piece of debris from this, that because of the fuel involved and a whole other set of reasons, don't go near it. Certainly don't make physical contact with it. We've been joined by Bob Moulter, an eyewitness to this from Palestine, Texas, there in the eastern central part of the state of Texas. Mr. Moulter, thank you for your patience, and thank you for sharing your eyewitness account. There is a Pentagon angle to this today, only because when people first heard the word, there were, of course, initial fears and jitters that this might be the result of something else aside from a systemic catastrophic failure on board the shuttle itself. NBC News Pentagon correspondent Jim Miklaszewski is with us for what he's learning from there. Jim?
Brian, first of all, Pentagon officials stress that there's no indication that there was any external factor that would have contributed to what happened aboard the Columbia. And in fact, they point out that at the altitude and speed at which the Challenger was traveling, that there are no organizations, terrorist or otherwise, and even militaries who could actually intercept and try to shoot down the Challenger, I mean the Columbia, the space shuttle. So they are putting to rest any speculation that there was anybody out there who had the ability to shoot down the Columbia. As to what happened on board, of course, that's all open to speculation. But again, no indication that it's anything other than an accident. Also, we're told that at the time that the shuttle was streaking across North Texas, that one of the U.S. military spy satellites, it's essentially an early warning satellite that keeps track, keeps a look down on the Earth to detect any kind of missile launches or explosions. It could be a nuclear test somewhere. And it was this satellite, we're told, that detected a heat spike at about the same time and in the same vicinity as the Columbia was when the apparent accident occurred. There's no analysis yet of the data as far as we know, but there is an indication, at least from one U.S. military satellite apparently, that there was an explosion on board. As far as any kind of search and rescue, the only search and rescue helicopters, planes that would have been in the air at the time would have only been around the landing site, the recovery site there in Florida, or when the shuttles take off. So there were no U.S. military planes or helicopters in the North Texas area. And we're told that just a few minutes ago in this domestic conference that's underway to deal with this tragedy, that it's been pretty much decided that any cleanup, rescue, any kind of recovery efforts will probably now be turned over to FEMA. They'll be the coordinating agency in an attempt to gather up some of this hazardous material that you've been talking about. Most of the activity as of now, however, is at the local and state agencies. There is some thought that if the U.S. military was needed, that the governors in Texas and Louisiana may call up the National Guard, but there's no indication of that as of yet. As far as the U.S. military, its involvement in this is now being conducted by the North American Command out there in Colorado. This was the command that was created after 9/11. It's essentially a combination of several of the U.S. military organizations, NORAD, Space Command, Strategic Command, to engage in homeland protection from external forces. But at this point, they're getting involved directly in trying to piece together exactly what happened and to help in any way that they can the recovery of any of the hazardous debris that has fallen to the earth in North Texas and Louisiana. Brian?
And Jim, isn't it interesting? I'm sure it's not lost on you. Back in '86, when we lost the Challenger, the Pentagon did not come to mind instantly. It just, we would not think of the Department of Defense in this, and it was the first thing that came to mind today to a lot of people.
Well, interestingly, in the Challenger explosion, I was here in the Pentagon, and I walked into an office here in the building, and the generals already had the maps spread out and were plotting the search and rescue efforts that were already underway instantaneously. But again, that was on liftoff. So those assets are in place on liftoff and during recovery because it's felt that if there were an accident would occur just like an airliner, it may happen, it's most likely to happen then. Nobody obviously was anticipating this, so there would have been no U.S. military assets in the air in that region.
Jim Miklaszewski at the Pentagon, where he will remain gathering information for us all day. Mick, thank you for that.
Okay, Brian.
Our next guest uttered the words magnificent desolation when he set his foot on the moon. Second man ever to do so as part of the crew of Apollo 11. Buzz Armstrong is with us from our Los Angeles Bureau. Oh, boy. There, I just merged the first and second Americans to set foot on the moon. You'll forgive me, Buzz Aldrin, for saying that. He's with us from our Los Angeles Bureau. And, Buzz, can you expand on a point we were discussing with Jay Barbary? The steady stream of data that is sent back from this spacecraft really makes up a live, real-time equivalent of a commercial aircraft black box, correct?
That's right, it does. Until there is a loss of external communication, and of course the black box on board aircraft continues to record the control system positions and many other parameters on board right up to the point of the loss of power supply. And the same is true with the voice recorder, that if communication with the outside world is lost, the voice recorder continues to record what is going on in the cabin, independent of contact with the outside world until the power supply to that voice recorder is terminated.
And Buzz, I don't want to get ghoulish here, but at this altitude, roughly 200,000 feet at this speed, roughly Mach 6, what's the heat level? What pieces, how much of the aircraft can survive?
Not any significant parts of the craft can survive. It would be fragments. The crew compartment, the pressure vessel, has an integrity that I think was demonstrated in the Challenger accident, that when a nearby catastrophic explosion took place, many portions of the shuttle came apart in pieces, but the crew pressure vessel, the crew cabin, did remain its integrity. On re-entry, the forces are considerably different for a prolonged period of time, and the heat load, depending on where in re-entry, is very considerable. So I don't think that once something began to come apart, that there are very many seconds of survivability left. The question is what kind of anticipation warning might the crew have had that things were going from bad to worse.
Buzz, we've never obviously had an incident on landing with this spacecraft before. You and I have spoken in the past about the project you've been interested in, kind of an alternative to the space shuttle, a different kind of space travel. Talk for a moment, if you will, about the viability. Here we are 113 missions into the space shuttle program after all.
Well, the shuttle is always being examined very, very closely for any potential wear or deterioration of its performance, and there is an entire program devoted to shuttle upgrades. And I just was in Washington recently speaking to General Mike Kostelnik about the long-range shuttle upgrade programs to prolong the life of the shuttle up through 2020 or beyond. A number of alternative proposals have been made as the shuttle goes through a maturing process. There's always been a consideration for whether an ejectable pod could be part of the upgrade that could contain the crew members as a more positive survivable mode than ejection seats. Ejection seats will only really work in the lower atmosphere and when the crew is protected after ejection from other very life-threatening devices.
And the whole theory only works when you have enough time to have warning, correct?
Well, yes, but warning conditions can be built into the reaction just like airbags for automobiles that react far faster than any human being could react to the onset of impact.
All right, Buzz Aldrin, who is these days the author of several best-selling books and, as you heard, a consultant on these projects, but of course best known. Sure.
Could I make a mention? I know I tried to mention this to the people covering this particular flight before it was launched, and it has to do with the presence of an Israeli astronaut on board. I'd like to remind the people that in 1985, before the launch of the Challenger, we did fly, as part of our Citizens in Space program, a Saudi prince who was a F-15 pilot, Prince Sultan. And he flew, of course, very successfully, and our entire program has been one, up to the Challenger accident, of exposing international passengers to the opportunities that we have.
A good point. I'm glad you added that. Buzz Aldrin from our Los Angeles Bureau, thanks. We're going to go back to our correspondent, Jay Barbary. It's important for us to remember, Jay, the people who made up this crew, and perhaps for those Americans, again, who haven't been following the space program, aren't conversant with the backgrounds and biographies of these crew members, you could go through them for us.
Okay, Brian, Rick Husband, he's 45 years old, a colonel in the U.S. Air Force. This was his second flight. He flew back in December 1994 on STS-96. This was STS-107, and Rick was at the controls when they were coming in. He was the commander of the flight, and he's a colonel in the U.S. Air Force. Sitting in the right seat was Willie C. McCool. He's 40 years old, a commander in the U.S. Navy. Of course, he's a former test pilot also. He was a rookie. This was his first flight. And the payload commander was Michael P. Anderson. Michael is a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. He's 42 years old, and he flew before on STS-89 in 1998, which was the 8th shuttle mirror docking mission. Anderson had logged over 211 hours in space before he went up. Mission Specialist 1 was David M. Brown, 46, a captain in the Navy. He's a naval aviator also, and this was his first space flight. He was a rookie. Another veteran on board was born in India. Her name is Kalpana Chawla, spelled a little different, spelled Kalpana, Chawla, pronounced Kalpana Chawla. Because they had trouble with it, most crew members called her KC. This was her second flight, and she was Mission Specialist 2. Mission Specialist 4 was Laura Blair Salton Clark. Now, Laurel Clark, 41, a commander in the U.S. Navy, she was making her first flight on board this 16-day experiment flight on board Columbia. Now, I want also to remind people that Columbia did not go to the International Space Station. It's the first flight in a couple of years that has gone up of a shuttle that didn't visit the International Space Station. The other crew member on board was the first Israeli astronaut. His name is Ilan Ramon. He's a colonel in the Israeli Air Force. He's a fighter pilot, and he was a payload specialist on this mission. We've heard a lot about him, and he's been training for 2 years to get up there. But those were the 7 people on board Columbia, Brian.
Jay, before I get to another guest who's been patient enough to wait for us, I have one question, and that is that when you come into contact with any member of NASA, any one of the astronauts, they are, as a rule, such impressive individuals. Spend a moment to tell us about the character required and the kind of swagger and bravery that is commonplace, everyday stuff to these folks.
Well, my friend Tom Wolfe wrote a book called The Right Stuff, and that pretty well put it in perspective. The original 7 astronauts, the Mercury astronauts, were extraordinary. Alan Shepard, our first man into space, he also flew Apollo 14, commanded it. He did it at a time after we had the near catastrophe with Apollo 13. He landed it on the moon. He was a graduate of the Naval Academy, as was our first man to go in orbit, John Glenn, who became a U.S. Senator from Ohio. All of these people were not only test pilots, but they were engineering. Most of them have degrees, PhDs. They're actually the best that this country has to offer, and it continues that way. Even though we have over 100 astronauts now, as the old saying goes, there's not a cull among them, and it is extremely hard to become an astronaut. I know people who have studied for years, who've taken additional courses, who've tried every time that NASA's naming new astronauts, and they didn't make it. As a matter of fact, the astronaut who flew the second mission to the moon, Pete Conrad, he was a commander of Apollo 12, he did not make the original cut of the 7. He was selected in the second cut, what they called the Gemini 9. That's how Pete got in, as did Jim Lovell, who is famous from the Apollo 13. He commanded the Apollo 13. Tom Stafford was also in that group, and Tom commanded Apollo 10, as well as a couple of Gemini flights. He also was a commander of Apollo Soyuz, the last Apollo mission, where they docked in July 1975. They docked in Earth orbit with the Russians for the first time. These are extraordinary people. They're the best this country or any country can produce. And we are only sending up our best in character and in knowledge when we send astronauts into space, Brian.
Jay, thanks for that. I think it's important that that thought be expressed. These are, to a person, extraordinary people. Jay Barbary, who we'll be going back to, of course, throughout the day. David Gregory is at the White House with more information. The president deciding to come back from Camp David today. David?
He has made that decision, Brian, and we're told he's about 15 minutes away. He'll be entering on the south grounds, either going into the residence or into the Oval Office. White House officials are here, the senior staff assembled, monitoring everything they can. The president, we're told, will make a statement to the American people at some point during the day, but not before NASA is able to draw some conclusions about this unfolding disaster. We have been told this morning by administration officials that while the investigation into any potential terrorist link is being fully investigated, that there's no indication that there was any foul play, no indication, as Jim Miklashevsky reported moments ago, that this is anything but an accident. We do in this country now have a Homeland Security Department that is operating at full speed today. The secretary of that department, Tom Ridge, got a call, we're told, by government officials shortly after NASA lost contact with Columbia. He's got a huge effort here in terms of coordinating the local response as well as the federal response. He and the president and his chief of staff, Andrew Card, in touch with Sean O'Keefe, who, of course, runs NASA. That call first made by the president at 10:30. The administration at lower levels has been in touch with the Israeli government. No call yet between the president and Prime Minister Sharon to exchange condolences. But back to the Homeland Security component, as I said, a massive effort underway. FEMA preparing to be the lead agency for recovery and response. The Coast Guard has been mobilized. The Secretary of Homeland Security, Ridge, has called the governors of Texas and Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arizona, and I believe those are all the states, to coordinate the public safety function here. There is a debris field that is extremely dangerous that should be avoided by members of the public in those areas. So Tom Ridge coordinating that function as well. So to repeat, we're hearing it from Homeland Security officials, Brian. We're hearing it from other White House officials. There is no reason to believe that this is anything but an accident. The president just moments away from the White House now, monitoring this with his top team and preparing to address the country at some point today, once NASA gets more information, can draw some conclusions and communicate that with the president.